Hi everyone. So today we're going to talk about reconstructing arguments. So just as a brief review, we're talking about 3 steps of argument analysis: identifying an argument, reconstructing an argument, and evaluating an argument. We started with step 3 and then we moved to step 1. And so today we're going to talk about step 2. How do we reconstruct an argument? So let's say you're reading a text or you're watching a speech and you've identified that the speaker or the author is making an argument. Once you've determined that they're making an argument, then you're going to move to step 2, which is argument reconstruction. And we've discussed this a good bit already, but we're going to be reconstructing arguments in standard form. The premises are numbered, written on their own lines, and then the conclusion is listed after the premises, also written on its own line, and both the premises and the conclusions are stated clearly and concisely as possible. So you want to avoid wordiness, you want to avoid ambiguity, you want to try to make it as clear what the author is saying as you can. And once you do this, it's going to make step 3, evaluating the argument, much easier. Okay, so within step 2 of argument analysis, argument reconstruction, there are 3 main steps, and that's going to structure our discussion today. The first step is to identify the conclusion. What is the author trying to get you to believe? What is the author arguing for? Conclusions can be explicit or implicit. They can be explicitly stated or sort of implied based on what the author's saying. And then step 2 is to identify the premises. What are the author's reasons or support for the conclusion? And again, these can be explicit or implicit. I think implicit premises are probably even more common than implicit conclusions. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how to fill in implicit premises. And then the final step is to apply 2 principles to your argument: the principle of charity and the principle of faithfulness. We've already talked about the principle of charity some. So go back, look at the argument, apply these principles, and then make changes if needed. Okay, so let's start with step 1. Step 1 of argument reconstruction is identifying conclusions. So the main way you identify an author's main conclusion is you say, what is the overall point of this text or speech? What is the thing the author is trying to get me to believe or wants me to believe? And most likely, that's going to be the main conclusion. And in doing this, like we learned in the last video, you're going to want to try to ignore the non-argumentative material. So descriptive or rhetorical writing, especially when it's just not relevant to the author's premises, you're going to want to try to ignore that, really hone in and focus on the argument. Also remember that any proposition on any topic expressed by any person at any time can be a conclusion. So conclusions aren't always super controversial. Sometimes conclusions are weaker than you might think they are. And one thing that's cool about critical thinking is that we can take argument analysis and apply it anywhere, in almost any topic. And so remember that, remember this when you're doing argument reconstruction: arguments can be basically about anything. Be careful with these common expressions. So some people will say things like, my argument is that, or I will argue that. And in a lot of cases, what this doesn't mean, here's my premises and then my conclusion. It really is just their conclusion or their main point. They're not going to be like listing out their argument for you. Sometimes in philosophy papers they do, but in most cases, this is just a signal or an indicator that this is the author's conclusion. It's also important to remember that sometimes, especially in a longer text or speech, even if it's one text, one body of writing, it can contain several independent arguments. Those arguments can be for the same conclusion, or it could even be arguments for different conclusions that even build on each other. So sometimes it's not just going to be, here's my 2 or 3 premises and my conclusion. It might be, here's 2 or 3 premises to support the conclusion, here's a different 2 or 3 premises to support the same conclusion, or they might have like 3 or 4 different conclusions, all with different premises. And then it's hard because sometimes those can even be mixed together, and premises that support the first conclusion might come later, and premises support the second conclusion could come earlier. So that's one reason argument reconstruction can be really tricky, but it's really good to keep this in mind and try to keep the author's conclusions separate, and then their reasons for each of those conclusion, sort of sort them based on the conclusion. Okay, some more tips for identifying conclusions. There are implicit conclusions, like we talked about. Sometimes conclusions just aren't explicitly stated at all. So your doctor might say, look, everyone who has high cholesterol is at risk of having a heart attack, and you have very high cholesterol. And then they sort of just let you make the inference. So sometimes you have to sort of fill in the author's conclusion for them, but at least in cases like this, it's very clear what the author is getting at. There are also really tricky cases where the conclusion that's explicitly stated isn't actually the conclusion that the speaker or author is trying to argue for. So I have seen cases where sometimes people say, I'm going to argue that this thing should be illegal. Maybe it's like drug use, maybe it's abortion or something. And what they really are trying to argue is that it's immoral, so it's morally wrong. And I've also seen the reverse where people say, I'm going to argue this is immoral, and they're really just giving arguments that it should be illegal. So that's one example. Another example I've seen is people say, I'm going to argue that some theory or proposition is true. And then what they're really arguing is just that theory is more plausible than some alternative theories, maybe Q and R. So the conclusion is actually weaker than the conclusion that they state. I do think you need to be careful here, and I think in most cases we should take the author's word for it and assume they're really trying to argue for the conclusion that they're arguing for. But in some cases, they might give conflicting reports of what their conclusion is, and if most of them are this other thing, but then once or twice they say this first thing, maybe we should go with the thing that they say more. Or sometimes to be charitable, we might say, you've said this stronger thing, but your arguments really seem to support this weaker thing. And then even though it seems like we're maybe not going by their exact intentions, sometimes charity could override that, and we're saying, I really think you're actually arguing for this weaker claim. So we do need to be careful here. And I think in most cases, again, don't assume that the author doesn't know what they're saying, but there are some cases where I think we're saying, this is actually where we should say, this is what I think your conclusion actually is. Okay. Another thing to note is that conclusions can be stated in unclear or obscure ways. They're very wordy, they're, involving all these different clauses. And when we're reconstructing an argument in standard form, what we want to try to do is state the conclusion as clearly and as simply as possible. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about conclusion indicators. So conclusion indicators are phrases or words that indicate this is what the conclusion is. They sort of point us. They're a little, an indicator that this might be what the conclusion is. So words like thus, therefore, hence, entail or entails, implies, it follows that, we may conclude, that's one's nice, it has conclude in it. This proves that, consequently, so, establishes, shows, and then, obvious ones too, like in conclusion, stuff like that. So, of course, these are really great and helpful tools to help if we see these words. Often we can think there is a conclusion around here. This is a good sign that this might be the author's conclusion, but these indicators aren't always present either. So they're not, it's not like it can't be a conclusion if one of these words isn't there. So keep that in mind. Another thing that's good to keep in mind is that conclusions don't always come last in the actual text or speeches, even though we put them last in standard form. And I think a lot of times in papers, people will actually say their thesis or conclusion at the beginning, and then in the body of the paper get into what their premises are. So it's good to keep that in mind as well. Okay, so that brings us to step 2 of argument reconstruction, which is identifying the author's premises. So hopefully at this point, using sort of the tips we've just talked about, you have a good idea of the author's conclusion, the main point, the thing the author's trying to argue for. And then to find the premises, ask yourself, what are the reasons or the evidence that is offered for the author's conclusion? And these are likely to be the premises. And again, we want to ignore non-argumentative material. The author might use rhetoric or tell a story, do certain things that sort of support the conclusion, but aren't actually reasons or evidence for the conclusion. They might just kind of convince people that the conclusion is true. So we want to try to ignore this and really focus on the reasons or evidence for the conclusion. So saying, this is obviously true, or anyone who doesn't believe this is dumb. Those aren't going to be good reasons or evidence. So we're not going to be paying attention to those. We want to pay attention to the real reasons or evidence. And again, like conclusions, premises can be on any topic. Critical thinking applies to pretty much anything you could want to argue about. Okay, sometimes, and we talked about this with conclusions as well, sometimes a premise that's explicitly stated isn't the one the speaker author intends to use for her argument. This isn't something we should be positing all the time, that there are these premises, you say this is your premise, but it's really not. But I do think in specific cases, the context can make us see that maybe this isn't actually the premise you meant to use. So if someone says, there's a first God, there's a first cause, and there's a first cause if God exists, so God exists. In this case, they might be trying to make a modus ponens argument, but they've switched the consequent and antecedent. So what they should have said is, if there's a first cause, then God exists. But they just sort of switch those two. So this might be a case where it would be more charitable to interpret them as saying, if there's a first cause, then God exists. But again, we should be careful with this, and in most cases, try to take what the author says their premises are at face value. Premises can be like conclusions, unclear and obscure, and so like we said already, we want to try to state the premises clearly and simply. Okay, so similar to conclusions, we also have premise indicators, words that indicate this might be a premise of the author's argument. Okay, so look for premise indicators like since, because, given that, for the reason that, on the basis of, normally that would be a premise, I conclude that, normally that would be conclusion, my reasons are as follows, my evidence for this is, and you can also look for even like if this, then this. Oftentimes what comes after the if is the premise, and then what comes after the then is the conclusion. But like conclusion indicators, premise indicators aren't always present. Premise indicators don't always come first in actual text or speeches. Again, similar to conclusion indicators, even though we put them first in standard form, sometimes the conclusion can come first and the premises second. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about implicit premises, just because I do think these are probably more common than implicit conclusions. Sometimes the author gives you one or two of their premises, but there's sort of background assumptions that they're making that they just haven't bothered to state. And that's one reason I think that this is so valuable, is it can actually help us see what is the author assuming in the background that they haven't talked about, and then is that thing plausible? Is that thing clearly true or false? I think that really helps us to see whether the argument is a good one. Okay, so here's a case of a implicit premise. So your professor says, look, if you partied the night before the quiz, you won't pass, you're not going to pass. In this case, the professor has actually given you only one premise, which says if you partied, then you won't pass. And then the conclusion is you're not going to pass. So there's an implicit premise. And that premise is that, in this case, it's very clear. The premise is you partied the night before the quiz. And so I think, sometimes it's kind of straightforward to fill in implicit premises, but in other cases it's not. And I think part of this, because it is really difficult to know what is the implicit premise or implicit assumption, this is one of the most difficult steps of argument analysis, is filling in what people are assuming. So here's some tips. And this is going to sort of preview our third step, but we'll talk about this briefly. So the first tip is following the principle of charity. When we're filling in implicit premises, we want to do so if it helps make the argument valid, unless you have a really strong reason to think the author made an invalid argument. But we're actually going to talk about at the very end of today why we should almost never reconstruct an argument as invalid. And then also add implicit premises that are reasonable to accept. So you don't want to add implicit premises that are just obviously false, that doesn't follow our principle of charity. And then the second principle that we're going to talk more about in a second is called the principle of faithfulness. And that basically says that when we're reconstructing arguments, we should do so in a way that's consistent with the author's intentions. So when we apply that to implicit premises, the idea is that you want to try to add an implicit premise that's consistent with the author's intentions, definitely not an implicit premise that contradicts or is in strong tension with something the author says somewhere else. So you want to try to look at the context, look at the author's intentions, and then use that to add implicit premises. And like I just said, keeping the context in mind is really important. Sometimes the context can help us decide between one possible implicit premise and another. So definitely keep the context of the broader work and the broader, just the broader speech or text in mind. And one thing that's really hard, and one reason why argument reconstruction is hard, is because I think in some cases, there are multiple equally good argument reconstructions. They're equally charitable, equally faithful, they both equally take into account the context. And sometimes these are actually pretty different reconstructions. And so I think we should realize that in certain cases, some people make arguments that are simply ambiguous between multiple readings. So we shouldn't always assume there's one perfect reconstruction and all the others are terrible. I think no, in actually certain cases, there can be multiple really good reconstructions. But this is another reason why argument reconstruction is so helpful. It can help us be really clear, like, what are we trying to say? And if you do have a chance to kind of talk to the author, you could say, here's a couple different reconstructions of your argument. Which is the one that you intended? And so just keep that in mind, that there's not always going to be one perfect answer here, because language is messy. And what we're trying to do is make it a little less messy. Okay, so a little bit more about implicit premises. There's two different kinds of implicit premises, general and specific. So specific implicit premises, they state facts about a certain individual or a specific thing. So here's an example. Someone might say, I know I passed the class because everyone who did well on the exam passed. Okay, so there is an implicit premise in this argument. They said everyone who did well on the exam passed the class. That's one of their premises. The implicit premise is I did well on the exam, and then therefore I passed the class. So notice that this is a specific implicit premise because it's about an individual. I did well on the exam. Okay. I think these are often a little easier to fill in because the author gives us the general statement, and then based on the conclusion, we can say who or what is that general statement supposed to apply to. Here's where it gets a lot trickier, and that's when there's a general implicit premise. So a general implicit premise state facts about a general category or kind. And these are a lot harder because it's hard to tell what is the category or kind that the author has in mind. So here's an example. That movie was directed by Frank Carracci. It won't be funny. So let's say someone says that and you're trying to reconstruct their argument. You might say, premise one, this movie was directed by Frank Carracci. All movies directed by Frank Carracci aren't funny. So notice we're adding a general implicit premise. It's about all of the movies directed by Frank Carracci. So this movie won't be funny. But look, I think The Wedding Singer is pretty funny. The Wedding Singer is clearly a funny movie. And so this might not be the best reconstruction of the argument because it seems like premise two is false. It's not the case that all movies directed by Frank Carracci aren't funny. So here's another attempt at reconstructing the argument. Again, that first premise, this movie was directed by Frank Carracci. All recent movies directed by Frank Carracci aren't funny. This movie is recent, so this movie won't be funny. It's tricky because we're going from all movies to some category that doesn't include all, but includes a certain number of movies, and then we have to figure out what exactly is that category. And when the author doesn't say what that category is, it can be really tricky. So this might be a plausible interpretation of the author's argument, but I think in this case, it's one of those cases where it's actually really hard to tell, especially since we don't have the context of the conversation to work with. But hopefully this kind of illustrates why general implicit premises are tricky. It's hard to know what the relevant general category is. But here's two, I think, helpful rules of thumb for general implicit premises. Okay, so when we're adding a general implicit premise to an argument, wide is better than narrow. So it's better to do a more general category or a more general grouping of things rather than a really specific grouping of things. But true is better than false. And I think this second principle trumps the first one. So it's better to do a narrow true generalization than a wide false generalization. But if the wider generalization is true, then go with the wider one. So if both seem true, go with the wider one. But if one seems true and one seems false, then go with the narrow one. So that's a general rule of thumb. But again, this is a tough process and it just takes practice. Okay, let's move to step number 3 of argument reconstruction, which is our 2 principles we've already kind of previewed a little bit, and we talked about the principle of charity in the last video too. So the principle of charity says when we're reconstructing an argument, try to make that argument as strong as possible. The principle of faithfulness, though, says that when we're reconstructing an argument, try to make that argument consistent with the author's intentions. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about each of these. So you've determined there's an argument here, you've identified the author's conclusion, and then you've identified the author's premises. So at this point, you hopefully have an argument in standard form. And then I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. So question 1, is this argument as strong as possible? Is it valid? Are the premises, true, reasonable to believe, or even known? And then ask yourself, okay, is this argument consistent with the author's intentions, right? Is this argument consistent with kind of the context, the other things the author says? Do you think I've faithfully represented what the author is trying to communicate? And sometimes these 2 can pull against each other. If it seems like the author is trying to communicate something that doesn't seem as strong, maybe you think the author is actually really trying to argue for this conclusion, even though they said they're trying to argue for this conclusion. And so kind of balancing these 2, it can be tricky. Of course, it's again a really hard step of argument reconstruction. But if you think, yes, this argument is as strong as possible and consistent with the author's intentions, then great, you can move to evaluating it. But if you say no to either step, then you need to go back to steps 1 and 2. You might want to reevaluate what you thought their conclusion is or reevaluate what their premises are. Whoops. And so maybe the author's conclusion is actually weaker than you originally thought. When you look at their argument, you're like, the premises don't support this conclusion. But the reason is because you're actually wrong about their conclusion. Their conclusion isn't this really strong one, it's actually a weaker one. And also maybe the author had implicit premises or even stated premises that you missed. So if you're pretty confident about the conclusion, you might want to go and look at the premises you're attributing to the author and see if those seem plausible. Okay. The last thing we're going to talk about today is what's called cheap validity. And here's something that's really interesting. So when you're reconstructing an argument, it's always possible to add a premise to make the argument valid. For example, let's say I say, it will rain tomorrow. My magic 8-ball said so. You might reconstruct that this way. My magic 8-ball said it will rain tomorrow, therefore it will rain tomorrow. This argument is clearly invalid, right? Just because my magic 8-ball said it will rain tomorrow does not guarantee the truth that it will rain tomorrow, because magic 8-balls, you just shake them and they give you a random answer, right? So, but what's interesting is we can actually reconstruct this argument in a different way that makes it valid. Premise 1 is the same. My magic 8-ball said it will rain tomorrow. Premise 2 says, if my magic 8-ball said that it will rain tomorrow, then it will rain tomorrow. Conclusion, it will rain tomorrow. So this argument is valid. It's a modus ponens argument. But premise 2 is clearly false, right? It's not true that if my magic 8-ball said it will rain tomorrow, then it will rain tomorrow. And in general, what you can do is you can make any invalid argument valid by just adding as a premise, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. And in this case, we just said if premise, then conclusion. So we just made it a modus ponens argument. And what you're really doing here, in a lot of cases, although maybe not all cases, is you're shifting the problem. So if the argument's plainly invalid, then you're going to, when you add this additional premise, what you're going to do is just, the problem is invalidity, and the new problem is that this additional premise is going to be clearly false. So you kind of pushed the bump in the rug. You've just shifted the problem with the argument to another place. But I think even despite that, I think when we're doing argument reconstruction, in most cases, it is a good idea to make the argument valid. This is for two reasons. I think when we just say, this is your argument, and it's just this clearly invalid argument, in most cases, that is not going to be charitable because most arguments do have implicit premises. Maybe the author was assuming something that they didn't explicitly state. So I think in most cases, it's going to be more charitable to reconstruct our arguments as valid. But once the argument is valid, then we can move to evaluating the premise, the premises. And this linking premise, if the argument's plainly invalid, it's probably going to be a pretty implausible premise, right? But I think once you reconstruct the argument as valid, the linking premise, you might be surprised. It might be less problematic than you think. So I think it's worth at least trying to make our arguments valid to the best of our ability. And then evaluating the premises. And I think in philosophy, in most cases, people give arguments that are valid. They just, a lot more happens with the premises debating premise one is true, premise two is true. So in practice, this is the way philosophers do it as well. They usually give valid arguments, but then just debate about kind of the merit of various premises. Okay, so what we have covered today. We've talked about why we do argument reconstruction in standard form. We've talked about the 3 steps of argument reconstruction, which is identifying the conclusion, identifying the premises, and then applying the principles of charity and the principles of faithfulness. And then we talked about cheap validity. So here's some lessons from today. We identify conclusions by asking, what's the main point? What's the main thing the author wants us to believe? Then we identify premises by saying, what is the author's support for the conclusion? When we add general premises, wide ones are better than narrow ones, but true ones are better than false ones. So it's better to have a narrow true implicit premise than a wide false implicit premise. We want to make our reconstructed argument as strong as possible, as the principle of charity says. We also want to make our reconstructed argument faithful to the author's intentions, as the principle of faithfulness says. And then we talked about cheap validity. You can make any argument valid by adding a linking premise, and in most cases, it's normally a good idea to do so. And a lot of the content from today was taken from Feldman, Reason and Argument, Chapter 5.